Hello everyone, good afternoon. I'm Chris, your host, and this session, John Keyworth is going to be discussing Meg Game Design for Dummies. John owns Kiwi Game Design, has done a couple of designs, but I'll let him talk about that in a few seconds. He's also a big part of Reading MegaGames here in the UK and Omega online games, online MegaGames as well, which obviously started up post-pandemic starting. John has designed Relics of the Fall and run it, I think, a couple of times, and was looking to do another run this year at some point. So look out for that. But over to you, John, for your presentation.
Okay, thank you, Chris. Yes, okay, so welcome to Mechanism Design for Dummies. So this is going to be a sort of a quick overview, basically, of game mechanisms as they apply to mega games. So, as Chris said, who am I? I design and run mega games, role-playing games, board games. Everything I've done is on, or everything I've done that's sort of publicly consumable, I guess, like ready to do, is on kiwigamedesign.co.uk. I've got some, bit of everything on there, and like you say, I help to run games through Running MegaGames and Amiga. So yes, there are the sort of overview of the talk. What are mechanisms and why would you want one in your game? Then we're going to discuss some various types of game mechanism that there are and sort of the pros and cons and some sort of do's and don'ts, and then give some general advice. And then the last section will be on places that you can find them and sort of overcoming the problems you might have adapting mechanisms from one type of game into a mega game. So it's a high-level introductory overview. We're not going to have any maths, game theory. We're not going to, deep dive in a particular sort of game mechanism to see how it works or anything like that. It's all going to be very sort of top-level stuff. Yes. So, what is a mechanism? So, for the sake of this talk, a mechanism will be a restriction on what players can do in character at a mega game. So combat resolution charts, incomes, that sort of thing. It doesn't involve, we're not going to be talking about sort of roles and teams, setting information, player advice, like things like venue safety advice. That's things you can't do, but it's not in character. It's things you have to not do. Yes, that is my sort of working definition. I won't dwell on that. Okay, so why would you want a mechanism in your game? You have to have them. You don't have to have them. People do play and run freeform games. They exist. They're good. They're popular. They have few or no mechanisms in them. They just generally work off briefings and player advice. But as yes, so that's why you might not want them, because you don't need them. But there are lots of good reasons to have them. So they can help people play the scenario and the setting that they signed up to do. They can keep people on the rails and make the game more coherent, especially if people don't necessarily have a sort of a really high level, really deep understanding of the subject matter. Rules will kind of keep people on track and it won't go off the rails too far from what you were hoping for. So in the same way, it keeps everything sort of consistent, especially with big games and sort of setting expectations. If you didn't have rules, you might end up with sort of cops and robbers problems of, oh, I shoot you. No, you didn't. You missed. Oh, no, I didn't. I did hit you. Like, if you've got a roll for it, you just roll the dice and it's done and you can move on. Everybody knows what's going on. You're all on the same page. They can help players who don't necessarily know what to do things. A problem in more freeform games, you get these cold starts where you're just presented with this big situation and told, go. But turn one, if you look at your rules and it says, I've got to be at the map doing this thing, then, well, you know what you do. You go to the map, you do the thing, and then it eases you into the game. And yes, it provides sort of obstacles for people to overcome. It gives people to talk things to talk about if you're discussing them in your negotiation parts of the game, that sort of thing. So yes, they can really help the game sort of come together. Right, so that is that. So a few types of mechanism that we find in mega games. Again, this is very sort of top level. So we're going to go through these in order. So the first sort of major type, you've got the sort of the game-wide mechanisms. So things that affect the whole game. So got phases and tables, like where should you be and where can you do it? You know, so when and where should you be doing things? And the resource and action economy is the sort of glue that keeps games together. Ideally, when you're designing a game, these are the things to do first, trying to get the big picture done so that you know what the nitty gritty is. So a sort of a top-down game design. I think there is a temptation sometimes to get a cool idea for a mini game and then get a bunch of mini games together and then try and make some glue to glue them together. You often get unstuck that way. But yes, and then yes, as well as this overarching stuff, you've got the mini games, the things that people are doing on a more granular level. There's a few types here. Obviously, you can come up with anything, but these are the types of games that I've sort of identified and we'll be talking about in more detail. So yes, the resource and action economy. So this is a game-wide thing. It underpins everything in the game. So it's going to be very important you get it right, and it's very hard to get these to sort of balance and to get right. Essentially, an economy is simply turning one type of resource into another type of resource. So maybe you go to a market and you spend 2 gold and you buy 5 food. That is an action within an economy. But it can also be other things, like I use this turn's worth of actions for this tank to attack somebody else, and it trades the tank's actions for removing hit points from someone else's unit. These are all economic actions. They're just framed differently. So all of this stuff ties in together. Everything is all part of the game economy, and everything should be tied into the game's economy. Otherwise, you've got bits of the game that don't touch other bits of the game. Another thing to bear in mind with economies is the players and their time count as resources as well. So where you are, how long it takes to do the thing that you need to do is a resource that you need to spend. If you can spend 1 minute doing an action versus having to spend 5 minutes going through the mechanical process of doing an action, that's very different. Even if the 5-minute action is a better, more efficient action in terms of resources, you might not want to do it because you've got things to be doing. You've only got 6 hours in your game or however long. Another general bit of advice, maybe this is a bit out of the blue, but when you're doing these things, definitely use small numbers. So single digits preferably. So like if you have to add something to something, make sure you're only adding 1 digit worth of something, even if the result's 18. Not everybody can do 56 plus 92 in their head and get 148. I think that's risky. 2 plus 3. That's the sort of maths we want to ask people to do in the games. And yes, last year, True North Design Symposium, they had, the whole thing was about mega game economies. All the talks for that are online, so that's a good place to look. Yes, balancing them is difficult. So here are some things to look out for when you are balancing them. So positive and negative feedback loops. So if you do a thing, and by doing the thing, it makes it easier to do the thing again, this is, on the one hand, what people look out for in games, because they want to be efficient, but it also, if it's too much of a positive feedback loop, it is a big problem. So if you can build a factory with money that lets you get more money, that becomes, game breaking. And the people that, or it can become a big problem in an economy, and the people that identify that will do really well. And by the time they get to turn, the end of the game, money is no object for them. And, the other teams who have not identified that are still struggling, and they're going to have two very different game experiences. You don't want to eliminate them entirely, but you need to dampen them down. And the same with losing. Negative feedback loops. Say if you lose in a battle and your unit is destroyed, next turn you have a battle, well, you no longer have that unit, so you're going to lose even more. And then you're going to lose the next turn even more than that, and your game is just going to be a spiral into misery. So you need to watch out for these negative feedback loops where losing just makes you lose more. So one of the ways of fixing positive feedback loops is making things cost exponentially more. So if it costs 5 to build a factory, maybe next turn it costs 10, and then it costs 15, or there's limits on things. You can put in things like auctions on sort of vanity goods, so that certain, or limited use resources, so that the people with all the money can go off and spend it doing ridiculous things, and it doesn't affect the rest of the game as much. Negative feedback loops, you can put in rubber banding, which is the more you fall behind, the tighter the rubber band gets, and then the rule snaps you back into the game. So you can say, oh, well, if you've lost a certain amount, then your public opinion will go up, because the people are rallying behind your losing cause. Like, there's a big external threat, and the people are really sort of don't want to be conquered by it. So suddenly other things become easy. Make sure that it makes sense, and make sure it's not out of the blue. People can get really annoyed if they win a fight and then suddenly the enemy is twice as strong. Dampen these effects down, don't eliminate them. You can do things like, especially in fights, if someone wins a fight, don't destroy the unit, have it retreat. Have it be more about area control. There's ways of making it so that the games aren't so swingy and the feedback loops aren't so bad. Yes, we don't want player competence to have a huge effect on mega games. Unlike normal games where you might want player competence to play a big part, mega games, because they have to appeal to a large variety of people, we want to dampen it down. And yes, so the other thing that's very useful is leaving control room to fix an economy that's going out of scale. These things are very hard to test. And so giving control levers that are built into the game is a lot better than having control have to turn up and say, oh, we're changing the rules, or we're giving this team a big sack of cash because actually we got it wrong. Introducing things that can, at design time for control to fix your mechanisms is useful. So that was a brief bit on economies. As I said, True North has a whole series of talks about it. The next game-wide thing, phases and tables. So phases are kind of when players should be doing things. So they can vary per role. So this is, at your team time, you should be at your team table. In your council time, you should be at the council place. In free time, you can do what you like. There's different phase. If you've seen existing mega game rules, you know what a phase is. They break up the turn and they make people do things at different points in the game. So they provide structure to a player's turn, they provide the sort of scaffolding, and they provide the sort of differentiation between the roles that you can get. And they can vary the pace of the game. So you want moments of excitement and you want moments of respite. So team time is good for, you must be at your team table. Not only does it give everyone the time to be together, and stop people from mingling, but it also gives you a moment where you can nip to the loo, you can do that sort of thing. Or you can, take a breather and just listen to what other people have to say. But you need those moments of excitement as well. So having, at the start of a turn, if there's a 5-minute phase where you go and do something cool and interesting that can sort of set up the rest of your game, that can be nice and exciting. But you can't have those excitement moments all the time. You need and the phases can provide the structure that makes them more likely to happen, but don't make them too restrictive. One of the worst things you can do is being stuck at a table for 10 minutes at your team time and then stuck at another table for 20 minutes for your mini game. And that's your entire game. And if there's not much to do, not much going on at your table, if you are the German defense minister during a game where no one's really going to war and it's modern day, so Germany isn't really doing much, they've got nothing you can have sort of credible threats with or anything like that. There's not much for you to do when you get back to your team table. At least if you can leave the table, you can make more of your own game. So if you restrict people too much, it can affect people's games. But some restrictions provides that good structure that can enhance the games. Tables, so that's the other sort of game-wide things. So these are places where only certain actions can be taken, so you can focus people in a certain place, maybe in a certain phase, maybe not in a certain phase. So, you obviously a team table is an obvious thing. The specific tables for mini games is a common bit of design. Not necessarily a fan, as you might have imagined, sticking people at tables for their entire game, but having a place where a thing is done will let similarly minded players gather, even if they don't have to be there. Yes. So again, these are restrictions on what you can do and where you can do them, but you can use them to your advantage by making, controlling the flow of players and yes, focusing people in places on certain things. Right, yes, on to the mini games. So there's component parts of the games. So map games. So most mega games have maps. You don't have to have maps, but they do make a good sort of centerpiece, and they are very good at conveying information to other players. So you've got two main types of map: open maps and closed maps. Open maps are good because they provide information to everybody and they're very easy to administer. They're just sort of the easy way to do it, I guess you could say. Closed maps have hidden information. So maybe you'd have two maps and one of them isn't available to all the players, or maybe only control will get to see the true map, things like that. So these can make nice, interesting fog of war effects. They can, make asymmetrical play. There, control the flow of information, that sort of thing, but it's a lot of control work. So if you do it, you need to be aware that it needs to be, part of your design needs there needs to be a phase where control are doing the map updates. You can have multiple maps that can be used to represent the same space, but you can have a military map and an economic map and an espionage map in different places. Again, this can be a lot of control burden to this. You've got to replicate effects from one map to other maps. If there aren't any effects from one map to another map, you're probably doing it wrong, because it's a mega game and everything should be linked in some way. But yes, it does stop maps from being crowded with information. It does stop maps from being crowded with players. And it can restrict the information and that sort of thing. But yes, you just have to be careful with the amount of time it takes for control to update things. Yes. So often related to maps, but not necessarily. Again, if you lose badly, obviously you've got the negative feedback loops. If they go out of control and you've completely lost, like this has happened at games before. If you've lost your entire military and you're in a military game, what do you do with the rest of the game? This is something you need to think about for any particular team, especially as small teams. They need a backup plan, or they need new roles, or they need they need to be able to turn into partisans fighting in the hills, or their game needs to change. Something needs to happen, and you need to think about it sort of mechanically at this time. Yes, and another thing to suggest for map games, which applies to all mechanisms in games, and decisions that people are making, but specifically the map games, it often happens, is to focus on strategy over tactics. So you should be making decisions at the strategic layer, which is like, where should my units be? What should they generally be doing? Rather than, well, we've got into a battle and now suddenly I'm making decisions about the tactics that they're using. So the reason for this is you want decision players to have time to make decisions in a way that doesn't hold everybody up. So if you've got 6 people at a map, 8 people at a map, 10 people at a map, however many, and they have to wait for someone to make a tactical decision. Oh, well, we've made this attack. The player already knew they were going to make that attack. That's his strategic level. It gets to their turn, they do the attack. Now, if suddenly both players have suddenly got to make 17 decisions about the stance they're going to take, the special cards that they're going to use, all this sort of stuff, it slows everything down. So ideally, you want to push your decisions to before the actions are taken rather than during the actions being taken. More general map design stuff. I did a talk last year at MegaCon on map design for dummies, which is less mechanical and more about the sort of the layout and the design of them, but it is also worth mentioning here. Right, moving on to council games. So you might think it's a council game, it's just some people sitting around having a natter. There are no mechanisms here. But if a mechanism is something that stops players from doing certain things, there should be mechanisms at play that during a council game. If there are not, it's people sitting around having a discussion, and there are probably better ways of having that. You don't need to lock people in a room to get them to talk to each other. So you need to decide how long is the phase. This is going to affect, how long they take to do those discussions, but also how much they get access to the rest of the game. If you lock your council players away for too long, they are going to be disconnected from the rest of the game, and they're probably supposed to make decisions that have an impact on the rest of the game. So they need to know about things. They need to be able to talk to people. So that's rather important. Who gets to set the agenda? Is there a chair? Is there talking points? That sort of thing. These council games should be structured in some way. Otherwise, they are very vulnerable to sort of filibustering and people being obstructive, or just generally not getting things done. Spending 6 hours not getting things done is not a productive use of your time. Whereas in the real life, in these situations, each turn might be, a day or a week. And so actually you can spend 6 or 8 hours having these big, long discussions. In a mega game, you need to get at it and making it more mechanical, let you get to the core of the matter. They get things discussed briefly, voted on, job done, moving on to the next thing. So yes, what voting system are you using? This can be very important. Who gets a vote, who doesn't, how many votes do you get? Do you need a simple majority? That sort of thing. These are all things to decide. Things like veto powers, they're quite controversial, shall we say. Some people just hate them and they never be using the game. I think you can use them, but you have to be very careful if you're giving someone a veto, especially an unlimited veto. If they start being obstructive, then it can just turn someone's entire game into nothingness. So you need to make sure that if someone has a veto power that they can use at will, if they use it all the time, what is this game now? Make sure, like losing a map, what is the backup plan? And they need to have direct mechanical links to the rest of the game. Whatever decisions you're making, you need to get information from the rest of the players should need to get information from the rest of the game in order to make their decisions, and then the decisions that they make need to be impactful on the rest of the game. So even if they're not the ones chucking the dice or collecting the tokens or whatever it is, they need to be aware that these things happen in order to have good, solid discussions that are going to impact the rest of the game. The third type of mini game, so we've got negotiation games, which sound like a council game, but for my purposes, a council game, you're sitting down and you're having a structured discussion. Negotiation games are more, this is what heads of state do in most games. So you are free form going around and talking to, ideally, everyone should have a bit of this in mega games. It is a big part of a lot of games, and it's a lot of, you know, it's good to talk to other people and not just get stuck in your little silos. But you have to be careful not to make, if you're having a council game and letting people do this free negotiation, there needs to be something that the council can do that side games can't do. Yes, because often the little side deals and things can render councils meaningless, because councils can have to go away, discuss things, come back with, and it all takes a lot of time. Sometimes these quick little side deals, actually they're best done out on the game floor in these sort of wider sort of negotiation sort of settings. So they need to be distinct from one another. All the players that are engaging in negotiations and you expect to negotiate, which is hopefully most people, should have something they can negotiate with, some resources, some information, access to certain places or actions, the ability to launch a credible threat, things like this. Otherwise, it's just hot air basically, and there's, you need things, you need to be able to trade things, you need to be able to have things to negotiate with, and each role should ideally be unique in this regard, or not necessarily, between the role and the team, it should be unique. There shouldn't be two people on a team that can do the same thing when it comes, have the same things that they bring to negotiations, or two, yes. So often this is a problem with deputies in the game. The deputy needs, basically they're a poor man's version of the head of state. They can do less. So when it comes to negotiation, they often have quite an empty game, unless their team leader is particularly good at delegating and doing that sort of thing. So ideally, give everybody a concrete thing that they can do. So maybe the deputy gets all the spy reports in, so they've got, information, I don't know, just something that distinguishes them from the head of state and can give them a unique position in negotiation games. So there's an excellent book, The Strategy of Conflict by Thomas Schelling, which I think everyone who's designing a mega game should probably read. It goes into a lot of sort of game theory and the game theory of negotiation in a very in-depth way. And yes, I can't recommend it highly enough. It talks about a lot of different ways that negotiations happen, even if you aren't talking to someone. There's too much detail to go into in just a short talk, so I'll move on, but definitely check it out. And the last type of mini game then is adventure games. Kind of come at this term myself, I think, but runs in mirror shades, expeditions. We had espionage at the Reading run of Shot Around the Universe, Heard Around the Universe worked like this. So it's quite role play like, but I will come on to why I don't think they should be too role play like. So you recruit players, you gather resources, and you get together and you do a thing, essentially. So these can be quite control intensive when you're doing the thing, unless your opposition is like fully automated or there's a player doing it, like in running hot with the runs, it can take up a lot of control time. So ideally, the adventuring sections, it would be very tempting to make this the thing, the big focal point. This is where all the rules should be. It should be big and exciting, and you're basically playing a role-playing game. Ideally, don't. Try and make them relatively short, because, like I say, it takes control time. If there's a particular phase for it, you might find you need twice as many control during this phase as you do for the rest of the game, which is not ideal. Instead, really, it's a mega game. You're talking to people, you're trading with people. The game should be in recruiting the party with the skills you need and acquiring the resources to get the job done. And once you get on the adventure, it should be a fairly mechanical process. As I was saying earlier, it's strategy, it's not tactics. It's, have I got the stuff I need? It's, logistically, will this adventure succeed? Yes, good, excellent. And then we can move on, which is, yes, how I would counsel doing that. Yes, so that is the sort of dives into the different types of game. So I've just got some bit of general advice. Luck and randomness. We've got two main types of randomness in games that are important to know about. There's a lot more reading you can do about these, but input randomness, you are given a random game state and then you have to do something about it. So if you're dealt a dealt a hand of cards and those cards are resources, that is input randomness. You've now got them and now you can do something with them. So it's very good for giving people some stuff to make decisions about, rather than having them make decisions and then roll a dice and fail. So it can be very good for making it making people's actions impactful, but still putting randomness into the games. And it gives people things to have problems to deal with, basically. Output randomness is where you try and do the thing and then you work out if it succeeded. It's often done in like combat and things. So most game design advice warns against it, because it's better to have the input randomness and a more reliable experience than putting in the resources to do the thing and rolling a wad and going, oh, I've just wasted 2 turns setting this up. It can be very disappointing. But you can, in mega games especially, you can kind of use it to kind of smooth out some of the predictability of the game, which allows experienced players to not game it quite so much. They'll still be able to mitigate randomness and things like that in most systems, but it can be more useful in mega games than usual. So the last part on randomness, be aware, dice and cards, excellent sources of randomness, but other players are probably the main source of randomness you're going to find in a game. So if you're playing the obvious example, rock, paper, scissors, there's no randomness in it, but it might as well be. So if you've got the randomness of rolling a dice and you've got the randomness of what the other player decides, be aware you've now got 2 types of output randomness in your combat resolution, because there's a dice and a rock, paper, scissors mechanic. And it compounds, so don't have accidental extra randomness that you weren't expecting. And then we've got some general design tips. So this applies to everything when you're designing a game, but it's very important for mechanisms. A game is done not when there's nothing more to add, but when there's nothing more to take away from it. So it applies to art. I can't remember where it comes from. It's usually attributed to basically anybody. But there is a right size to a game, and the size is probably smaller than you think, which is not to say that every game should be tiny and streamlined. It's to say that if there's a mechanism in the game and it might, make sure you look at it and say, well, can I make it simpler? Can I remove it? The answer might be no, you might need it, and you might need that logarithmic combat table. You might need that 10-page, process for resolving something. And if you do, then it needs to stay in the game. But try and analyze every single mechanism in the game and say, well, can it be removed? Can it be streamlined? Can it be smaller? And another general piece of advice, applies to everything, but also this: kill your darlings, slaughter your sacred cows. If you've got, so say you've had this idea for a game, and the whole thing centers around having a giant Jenga tower in the middle, and you think it's going to be really cool and really exciting, but you've written the game, and it turns out you probably don't want, the giant Jenga tower is a distraction, and actually the game would work better without it. Kill it, get rid of it. I know it was the reason why you came up with the game in the first place, but it needs to go. You can't get too attached to anything. So yes, put it in the bin. This can apply to all sorts of things, and it's a very hard lesson to learn. Ask for help, usual advice. If you're designing something, someone else probably knows, someone else has probably often done it before. And then the last general tip, so try and have a high skill floor and a low skill ceiling. So a skill floor is how easy it is, if you're bad at the game, how effective you are. And the skill ceiling is how good can you get at the game ever. So a high skill floor would mean that anyone can rock up and kind of do okay. And this is what we want. People are rocking up to MegaGames. They might be inexperienced. They probably only play it once. They may not have even read the manual. We kind of want them to have a good day. If you have a low skill ceiling, it means that the super experienced players that have been playing for 20 years and go to wargaming tournaments or something aren't going to just completely ruin the game for everybody else. They will get something out of it, but don't let them completely dominate the whole thing. So that's on to the last section now. Yeah, so yes, finding mechanisms. So obviously I haven't discussed any individual ones because this is a quick talk. It's kind of a big overview of stuff. So where can we find these things? So yes, another often misquoted or misattributed quote: great designers imitate, good designers imitate, great designers steal. So there is nothing wrong with just taking entire chunks of another game. I mean, there might be, I'll come on to that later, but in principle, there is nothing wrong with just taking a big chunk of another game and say, oh yeah, this is what I need. So the players who turn up to your game don't care. If you're designing something novel, is only really interesting to the game designer. And it is interesting, and it's, intellectually stimulating and all that. And it's kind of nice to do, and it's kind of one thing we like doing. But your players really don't care. If it works, they will enjoy themselves. And if it doesn't work, no matter how innovative or new or novel it is, unless they're also another game designer who is sort of appreciating it on a more abstract level, they won't care. So yes, make sure you play as many games as you can. Try and keep the handbooks for the games. I've got a big library now of handbooks from other games that I've kept, where I can sort of dip in and out of. Mega Game Makers and Mega Game Assembly have plenty of free games listed. If you look through, both of those sites have calendars which include past games. So go through the past games as well. If there's something, especially if it sort of links up with what you're doing, try and reach out to the designer. There's a good chance that they'll be happy to talk to you. So that's where we can get from Mega Games. Where can we get that's not Mega Games? Because there are only so many games you can attend, and only so many games that are freely available. So board games are the obvious one. So yes, going to board game clubs is an excellent way of playing lots of different games, and there's no substitute for playing games. You can read all the manuals in the world, you can talk about theory all day long, but playing games, Mega Games, board games, whatever else, There's no substitute for it, basically. Board Game Geek, the website, I would say at least half of the games on there have their rule books on the website. So if you've got a theme, you're setting for a game, someone's probably written several board games about it. Go and get their rule books, have a read through. It's a couple of books that I would suggest picking up if you want to find good sort of discussions of the sort of nitty-gritty of mechanisms in board games. New Tactical Games with Dice and Cards is possibly my favorite book about game design. Probably is, actually. It's probably my second favorite book about games in general. But it is just an excellent, because it only uses dice and cards. It really tears into how these things affect things, how to get things to work, and how to make things simple and with a sort of a very basic set of mechanisms. I can't speak highly enough of it. We've got Building Blocks of Tabletop Game Design as well, which is very good. It's a list of game design patterns. So that's got lots of things that you can include in games, how they work, what other people have used them, pitfalls, that sort of thing. Board games do tend to be harder to learn and have a lot more room for mastering them than mega games, but so you really need to, again, strip things back, but they're a good source of mechanisms. Role-playing games can be good. Traditional role-playing games like D&D, but also things like structured freeform games, Fiasco or Witch, or world-building games like Microscope or Intrepid, quick plug, or things like that. They've got a lot of interesting mechanisms that you can borrow from. Live role-playing games are often quite big, like mega games. I'm not going to tell you what the difference between the mega games and LARPs are. You can work that one out for yourself. But yes, they've often think a lot about how things affect player experience as well, which is something that we can learn from. Collectible card games are usually far too complicated for our use, but the cards are excellent as a resource for if you've got a team with a special power or a card that needs to do a special thing. The cards from collectible card games, they're often available online for free. I know Magic the Gathering and Netrunner are both available online for free. Reading cards is an excellent way of finding these little individual unique abilities, which you can, mine basically to put into your games. Right, and then another couple of other types of games you may or may not have heard of. So reactions to past games are this type of game that are educational, and they're usually exploring like a bit of history. It's more of a sort of a deep dive into the history and more about the learning that it is about the, our historical games, which are more about playing the game. But they have some cool and interesting mechanisms in them that I haven't seen elsewhere. And matrix games, which if you listen to Rob's talk, you'll have heard him mention, and half of you will be well aware of, and the other half of you may never have heard of at all. But they get a lot done out of a very simple set of rules, and they can be an excellent base to build a mega game on top of, I will say, because of their sort of starting simplicity. Yes, so here's some things to look out for when you're adapting. Games, you need to be very careful. So make sure you know what you want the mechanism to do, and don't just include it to be cool, which is kind of the giant Jenga effect. Make sure that you understand what it does. So there are a lot of, just pulling one mechanic out of a game can kind of take it out of context, and sometimes it can ruin it. Obviously everything needs to be connected to everything else. So you have to be very careful when you're pulling something out that it will then fit nicely into the thing that you're doing with it. And make sure it works specifically for a mega game, not just for the game that came from it. If you pull out chess, obviously, it's got too high a skill ceiling, and some people will just dominate at it. So, be aware. And yes, it should probably be simpler. It should probably be stripped back from wherever else it came from, because most people are only going to play it once. Half the players won't have read the rules, and there's a huge amount of time pressure. So yes, that seems to be what I'm saying a lot, but it's a very important lesson to learn. So yeah, that was everything. Thank you for coming. Yeah, so are there any questions?
Yeah, that's brilliant. Thank you, John. Really fascinating talk. I think there's a couple of comments which I'll let you read in the chat there. One question I've got for you though, just to confirm, your Cataclysm was your game, your pay-by-email game, is that correct?
Yes, it was.
Excellent. Okay, so
Yes.
in that case, then, on that basis, Jacob's got a comment for the veto power that you talked about. He played the email game, which is obviously Cataclysm, where everyone had a veto, but also that the vetoes were rarely used because there was a big political cost for doing so. Other players refused to work with these people who used the vetoes, and were quite often there was revenge vetoing going on, which is actually quite fun. But yeah, certainly from my perspective as well, I've thought about vetoes for the upcoming game we're going to do, and you want to be careful that, like you mentioned, people don't have unlimited vetoes to use.
Yeah, so in Cataclysm especially, you had, I think it was like 5 things that you were going to get implemented in the turn, and you had 1 veto to use that turn. So you could say, we're never taking this option from the list of 10 things we can do, or however many. We will never do that because I've vetoed it. So you can't veto everything. And obviously it pisses people off. And because you can't veto everything, you have to work with everybody else. If you could just veto everything because everyone had the veto power, even the political cost of using it wouldn't be a restriction, because you could just veto everything for days. But because you can only do one thing, you need to, it's mechanically set up so that you have to work with people, even though you've got this veto power, and it does cause disruptions. And so there were 2 teams, and one of them had it used a fair amount, but it was a major point of tension, and the other team I think used it once in the entire game. It was only a 3-turn game, but that sort of thing.
Well, fair enough.
So I think it can be done.
Yes, yeah, totally. And regarding numbers, obviously you spoke about numbers earlier in the presentation. Patrick was saying you shouldn't also not ask people to do more than one operation, even those good with maths will struggle with more than one thing on at a time.
Yes, yeah. If you asked me to, whatever that sum was, I don't know if I got it right, but if you asked me to divide it by 3, I'd have then struggled.
Yeah, fair enough. I would have struggled around, I think.
Yes. Yeah. Although it might be 49 1/3. When it comes out on the video, you can look it up.
Absolutely.
But
one final question from Alex. Are there any mechanics that are used in another game that you would really want to use in a mega game, but you haven't found a way to make them work yet?
Yes. I will just flick back through here to try and get some inspiration. I will say, yes, the reacting to the past have this really nice mechanic. It's probably the main thing you could probably steal from it, but they're sort of extra activities that you can do within the setting in order to kind of earn these little benefit points. So if you can, if you're doing one of the games that I've got the handbook for is sort of set in 1918, and it's half of the game is kind of about sort of votes for women, women's suffrage, and the other half is a sort of socialist sort of striking-y kind of thing. But you can imagine a game like that. If you can make some flyers for it, you will gain bonus points, basically. So at the game, if you make a sort of a flyer that puts across your political point, and you can put them up around the hall, that could sway an election or something. I don't know exactly. Yeah, putting that sort of arts and crafts kind of thing into a mega game is a little bit weird. So I haven't got a good use case for it, but I think doing something like that, putting these little sort of, if you engage with the source material, something cool will happen. like,
Yes.
and we will encourage you to do it.
Sure. We'll reward you for doing so.
Yeah, it's like turning up in costume. It's just another way of doing that.
Yeah.
Obviously, you've got to be careful, but yeah, that's a kind of a cool thing.
That was fascinating. Thank you very much. I think we've hit the time, but no, thank you, John. That was really good. I'll just say, if anybody wants to carry on talking to John, the pub Discord on our pub channel on our Discord server is open, so please feel free to go in there and have a chat. Our next talk up at 5:30. So yeah, thank you very much, John. Appreciate it.
Like I said, get help. So if anyone has any other questions or specific needs, then let me know.
Yeah, most definitely. Agree with
that.
Do all I can. Thanks very much. See you later, everyone. Cheers.